Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. And thank you, Naomi. Such a powerful movie, film, such a powerful message, and so illustrative of perhaps the reason why we're here, which is to really take home an important message, which is pretty much, it's centered around the way our societies are organized, the way our governments organize societies, and that the way that these societies are organized are directly in conflict with the direction we need to take to stop us walking into, to stop this existential threat to us as human beings, this existential threat to planet Earth. And it's really thanks to activists, to scholars like Naomi Klein, and the courage that we can really understand not just climate change as something which belongs to the normal study of the environment, but it's something that it's interconnected with the way our society is organized, with capitalism, neoliberalism, and so many other factors. So Naomi needs no introduction. She's the author of No Logo, The Shock Doctrine, This Changes Everything, No is Not Enough. She is a senior correspondent for The Intercept. You've read lots of her work in newspapers like The Guardian, Le Monde, New York Times. And in 2016, she was awarded Australia's prestigious Sydney Peace Prize for exposing the structural causes and responsibility for the climate crisis, for inspiring us to stand up locally, nationally, and internationally to demand a new agenda for sharing the planet that respects human rights and equality, and for reminding us of the power of authentic democracy to achieve transformative change and justice. So I can say that today we are really honored to host Naomi Klein. I would like to thank the National Book Council, Mark Miller and his staff for making this possible. So please, another round of applause, a warm welcome for Naomi Klein for being here with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very excited to be here. And I think...
Before we start, I just want to say how pleased I am to be here, and Matthew, to be in conversation with you, and to thank everybody at the book fair, particularly Mark and Simona. This is my very first time in Malta, and I'm just delighted to be here.
So I wanted to start off perhaps with one of the central tenets in This Changes Everything, where the existential threat of climate change really doesn't come any starker. And I think one of the central tenets in This Changes Everything definitely is the way society is organized around the profit of a few, and how this puts us in direct conflict with what we need to do to stop the Earth from getting warmer, to stop us from going into this direction. Mm-hmm. This central tenet is basically the challenge to the free trade orthodoxy. It's an orthodoxy that is central to the way we live, the way governments organize themselves around the demands of the free market. It's also the logic of indiscriminate economic growth, which I think is something that is really central to the way governments think and to the way voters respond as well to governments, which is always going for indiscriminate economic growth. But obviously, there is a cost to this political philosophy, to this economic philosophy.
Right. So what I argue in This Changes Everything is that if we want, we often hear these theories about why we could know so much about the crisis, about the fact that we are rendering our own home uninhabitable. Nothing that people saw in this film came as a surprise. We know that the Great Barrier Reef is basically dead. We know that we are already experiencing severe impacts of climate change. record-breaking storm after record-breaking storm. The migration that Malta has been in the middle of over these last few years is also linked to climate change. It's not, a one-to-one causal relationship, but we know that a historic drought in Syria was a major accelerant of the civil war, was a major factor in creating internal tensions that set off the civil war. Not the only one, but climate change layers on top of all of the other factors that are kind of boiling our world politically and ecologically. So we often hear that the reason why we can sort of live with the cognitive dissonance of hearing ever more sort of alarming warnings from climate scientists and yet continue on with our daily life as if nothing is happening, or even sort of double down on the very activities. In that film, which I made in Australia, I was concentrating on this sort of absurdity that they are in the midst of building this huge coal export terminal right next to the Great Barrier Reef that is in the middle of dying. When I talk about it in my home country of Canada, I point out the sort of madness that there is this scramble to find oil in the Arctic because the ice is melting because of climate change. But here in Malta, you are, just reading the papers, I see all of these political controversies relating to oil drilling, LNG, fossil fuel related expansion, right? So we're all putting our foot on the accelerator. And we often are told that this is just human nature, right? That we're just, if there's something fundamental to the human character that is just too greedy, too self-centered, incapable of thinking beyond our most immediate needs. And what I argue in This Changes Everything is that is not true, that we have been told a lie about the reasons why we failed to act, and that there are much more to do with political economy. And in fact, an epic case of historical bad timing, by which I mean that this collective crisis landed on our laps at the worst possible moment in human evolution, which was the peak of the neoliberal economic project, right? So one interesting, there was the moment when governments came together and said, okay, the science is in, the science is clear, we need to talk about climate change, was 1988. And it was actually Malta's foreign minister who was the first government official to talk about the need to come together to talk about climate change at the UN General Assembly. And later that year, they had the first meeting of governments to talk about reducing emissions. And so what I do in This Changes Everything, as you know, is say, okay, well, what else was happening in 1988 that might have stood in the way of that momentum? It was the eve of the Berlin Wall collapsing the next year. It was the year that Canada and the US signed the first free trade agreement, a neoliberal free trade agreement that eventually turned into NAFTA. And so the logic of that economic project, privatization, deregulation, so-called market-based solutions, right? Growth and profit at all costs, was really what stood in our way, because how can you subscribe to that orthodoxy and do what is necessary to transform your economy? You need to invest in the public sphere. You actually need to plan and manage your economy, right? You need to make priorities, not just leave everything to the market. And so, we as human beings have been pathologized for a very deliberate set of economic policies that were in fact opposed by many human beings on this planet, right? And there are many ways of being humans. I mean, we know that there are many human cultures, the oldest human cultures in the world, have very long time horizons. In Canada, Indigenous people talk about our responsibilities to 7 generations into the future, right? It is possible to have a culture that respects very different kinds of time frames than the one that we have.
Let me just maybe, if we could just delve quickly into sort of some recent history in terms of what happened in the late noughties, because what we have today, these people like Bernie Sanders, Jeremy Corbyn, or parties which have a climate-based agenda, also have the roots in a form of protest to what happened after the financial crisis in the late 2000s, and the effect and the reaction to austerity measures, which was also a time where climate change was also on the back burner, and obviously provoked by the financial crisis, and that's another problem which basically afflicts political movements with a climate agenda. So maybe I wanted to ask you something about that part of recent history, but also something about the cost of fighting climate change. It's not just about green technology, it's also about polluter pays principle, finding the money to reduce emissions. A Malta angle to this could be the fact that Malta is also one of the biggest shipping registers in the world. I think it's the fourth or fifth largest. And it's also one of the best destinations for global tax avoidance. So I think there might be a link as well there between global tax avoidance and climate change in terms of the economics of it.
Absolutely. And I mean, in this case of historical bad timing, in this period when governments were meeting and talking about how we all needed to lower our emissions, there were simultaneous meetings going on where governments were coming together to design the World Trade Organization to facilitate the flow of goods and products around the world, and actually to design the most emissions-intensive way of building economies you possibly could, which really, and specifically didn't count the emissions related to shipping. No country has to take responsibility for the emissions that are associated with the carbon burned as our goods travel between countries. So you mentioned Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn in this moment that we're in. It does cost a lot to battle climate change. We need to invest in the public sphere on a huge scale to transform how we move ourselves around, how we live in cities. It also costs a lot not to deal with climate change. The latest IPCC report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, estimates that the costs within the next few decades of dealing with climate change is going to top $54 trillion, right? So it's actually more expensive to not deal with climate change than to deal with climate change. But once again, we have the problem of time frames. Those costs are off in the future, whereas the costs of dealing with climate change and transforming our energy systems, our transportation systems, our urban landscapes, those are costs that we have to bear right now. And the money has to come from somewhere, right? And this is why these figures like Sanders, I think, are you really have it right with the Sanders plan is what he calls a Green New Deal. He's not the first person to use this phrase. Some people talk about a Marshall Plan for the planet. But the point is that we have historical precedents, whether it's the New Deal or the Marshall Plan, where there have been these large-scale investments in transforming public infrastructure. But you do need to tax, and this is where I think your point about Malta comes in. We live in a time of unprecedented private wealth. You're attracting a lot of it to Malta, but you're not the only place in the world where these trillions in profits are disappearing into offshore tax havens. And so we have this duality where we know that companies are making more money than anyone in the history of money. I mean, Apple, made $1 trillion, right? Just one company. And yet our governments are always pleading poor and telling us that they don't have the resources to pay for the transition that we now know we have the technology to do. We've got great research out of Stanford University. So, I mean, the Sanders model is make the polluters pay, close the tax loopholes, increase taxes for the very rich, introduce things like a luxury tax, financial transaction tax. I mean, there's all kinds of ways to capture more of that private wealth and use it to create a jobs boom, right? Because we also have a problem of not enough well-paying jobs, and we can get those jobs in renewables, we can get those jobs in transit, I mean, Malta's in the middle of a building boom, but it's not an energy efficient building boom, or not nearly enough of an energy efficient building boom as it could be. It needs, what I've been arguing is that justice, social justice, labor justice, has to be at the center of this transition, because for too long, the environmentalists and the unions weren't really talking with each other, or were in conflict with each other. And so what a lot of people who I talk to in the trade union movement say is, look, we know there are jobs in solar, and we know there are jobs in wind, but those jobs pay $13 an hour, and I'm getting paid, $150,000 a year to put down pipelines. We have to make sure these are well-paying jobs. And so the sort of siloing of movements, right, where you have a lot of different movements that are not talking to each other, that are not trying to come up with this common plan, is really hindering us. And so that's the idea of the Green New Deal. And I think Jeremy Corbyn also has some very good green policies of talking about how do we create good unionized jobs that lower our emissions in a hurry. And that's the discussion we need right now. We also have new politicians in the States like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who just is one of the generation of young Congress people who were just elected in the midterms, and she's running on a platform of the Green New Deal. And I think it's, the wave of the future. I think it's a way to create good jobs locally. Malta's bathed in, potential for renewables. You're having a lot of fights about, fossil fuels, which I don't really understand why that's the focus still.
I think something that people will surely understand is that even the Maltese experience here is one which has had to deal with a sort of fragmented environmental movement. But in reality, we have been facing the onslaught on our environment is always coming from the same people, which are basically corporations. They're obviously profit-minded, and they are aided by policies which are, at the end of the day, written down by government and other party MPs. So I think there's obviously some similarity in the experience of the Green movement as well over here, and there's definitely even a need in Malta to ramp up the environmental movement's strength. And it's not just about even social justice.
Yeah, and I mean, part of it has to be about making sure that we don't repeat mistakes of the past, right? In Spain, for instance, there was a big green energy boom, but it was done in such a way that alienated a lot of people. The benefits of the transition were in the hands of a few corporations, a few farmers. The model that we see gets the most buy-in on renewable energy is when you have what's called energy democracy. So as you switch from big fossil fuel projects to renewable energy, you don't switch from sort of mega LNG projects to mega solar farms necessarily. You can have, the thing about renewables that's wonderful is that they're everywhere, right? So you don't need such centralized infrastructure that is such a magnet for political corruption. You can have community-controlled renewable energy and microgrids, where the profits are owned by communities, they stay in communities, they can use the profits to pay for services, and the jobs stay in the community, so you have these triple wins, and that's how you get buy-in, as opposed to what they did wrong in Spain.
Okay, moving on, you mentioned Sanders. I wanted to ask you something about Trump.
Okay.
But not just about Trump as the person who sometimes gets to enjoy a viral video here and there. We treat Trump as some sort of kind of funny phenomenon in American politics. I think it's good to explain exactly what Trump's brand is. The big brand, the whole family is a brand. So where does Trump fit in as a brand? And even, I think Slavoj Žižek said he sees a positive function in Trump because he feels he's the kind of politician to give a shake-up for the radical left. And it's true that the victory of Trump in America was also down to ground which was ceded by the center-left, which enabled Trump to win working-class votes. And I think we also see similarities in Europe, where the hard right capitalizes on the fear of migration and wins over voters traditionally belonging to the center-left. I think we've also seen it in Brazil with Bolsonaro, who has obviously had a massive mandate.
Right.
So
Duterte in the Philippines as well. Yeah, there's a wave of these sort of strong men character.
So let's just start with Trump.
Yeah.
What is Trump as a brand?
Right.
But also, if the worst should happen in America, what would Trump do? What's on his, in terms of shock economics, what would be on his to-do list?
Well, so what I argue in No Is Not Enough is that Trump is the first human brand to be president, right? I mean, he is a fully commercialized brand, and that's why he was able to have no political experience and go directly to the White House. He's a little bit like Berlusconi in that way, and the Italians will tell you that they try all the bad ideas first. Trump is a little bit, he's different than Berlusconi in the sense that Berlusconi's, he didn't build the brand around his name, around his personality, right? He has this media, sporting empire, and so on. So Trump is different because his brand is built, he represents this total blurring of the lines between the person and the corporation, right? And what's dangerous about Trump's ascendancy to the presidency is if you look at the brand he has been building and occupying since the 1980s, his brand is impunity through wealth, right? That is the dream he has been selling, is if you have enough money, you can do whatever you want to whomever you want. You can break whatever laws, you can cheat, you can grab, and whoever. And then even on the election trail, he said, and this was the scariest moment, he said, I could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and get away with it, right? And he wasn't joking, right? That his relationship, like we have a press corps, journalistic press corps that kept treating him like he was a normal politician, like they were going to be able to catch him finally. And that would be like the smoking gun, and his supporters would turn on him. But there's no way to catch Trump because whenever he's caught, like the New York Times just spent months and months doing this incredible investigation of how his entire, economic story of how he got wealthy was a lie, that he's cheated on his taxes, and his father did, and they've cheated, New York State out of millions upon millions of dollars. It didn't get any traction at all. I felt so terrible for these journalists because they had worked so hard. The New York Times ran an entire standalone supplement. I've never seen anything like it. Nothing. Because all it did was reaffirm the Trump brand, that he's the guy who gets away with it, right? And that, if anything, kind of built respect for him. So it's a real crisis. It's a crisis for journalism. How do you hold a politician accountable if everything just bounces off of him? And so you asked about how he would exploit shock. I mean, he's already had opportunities. Like I went to Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria. Puerto Rico is still a U.S. colony. And the Trump administration is working with local officials in Puerto Rico to use the hurricane as the shock to privatize the entire island, to turn it into even more of a tax haven for U.S. businesses and wealthy individuals. They've got a scheme a little bit like you've got here in Puerto Rico. In the U.S., now that the Democrats control Congress, my fear is, what it would take for Trump to sort of declare a state of emergency, a state of exception, right? and he's already made his antipathy for the press very, very clear. Even after, I mean, what was so frightening about these midterm elections, you talked about Trump as a funny figure, as a joke. Anybody who's still laughing about Trump has a real problem, you know? When he was running 2 years ago, I think it was possible to sort of tell yourself, well, he doesn't really mean it, and he used to be a Democrat, and maybe he does, you know, maybe this is all just theatrics. This guy is a reality TV star, he's all about performance. But what just happened during these midterms, I think, shows that he really means it, because in the middle of this campaign, there was a wave of hate crimes, right? There were 2 African Americans who were killed by a gunman simply because they were black in a supermarket. The next day, 11 Jews were killed in a synagogue, the most extreme anti-Semitic attack in US history. And what was so frightening about this was, as these attacks were happening, and then pipe bombs were sent to CNN, to the Obamas, to George Soros, to all of Trump's enemies, right? And there was this one moment where we thought, is he going to pull back? Is he going to tone it down? And he thought about it, and then he said, no, I'm going to put my foot on the pedal. And he started using even more inciting language, and he made this decision to make the election all about the invasion of Central American migrants. So he continued to rile up his base in the middle of really a bloodbath, when it was clear that more and more of them were taking up arms and putting his rhetoric into action in the form of hate crimes. So there's nothing funny about Trump. And to be honest, like, being here as a woman and as a journalist of many years, as an investigative journalist, I feel a real responsibility to talk about how horrified I am by what happened to one of your journalists, to Daphne Caruana
Galizia.
Yeah, Galizia.
And I think it does tie as well with what you said about the feeling of impunity. Because in this case, Daphne, today, I think we should tie it in as well with today's news. Dealt with one of the stories that Daphne Caruana Galizia was working on back in 2017. And once again, one of the questions that journalists ask is always about the impunity of people in power and the inability of journalists to sort of to chip at this edifice of impunity, which is what you mentioned before. And it does tie in, obviously, as well with the experience of Daphne Caruana Galizia as a journalist, of other journalists. But I stopped you right in the middle there.
Yeah, I've been reading up about her case, and I have to say, I mentioned to you that this is my first time in Malta. And as I would mention to colleagues, other writers, other journalists, that I was coming here, they would all talk about Daphne. I mean, her story, her case is one that anybody who works in journalism around the world is paying attention to. And, I'm a member of PEN, and support the Committee to Protect Journalists. And there has been this unanimous call from all of these different organizations, and I know you've heard about it, for there to be an independent inquiry to really find out with seriousness and independence what happened, how it can be prevented, the links with the journalism that she was doing. And I understand that this is a very, partisan country, and that there are different factions here, and it's really hard not to see something like this through the lens of partisanship, right? I have no doubt that I would have had political disagreements with Daphne, but that's not what this is about, right? I mean, thinking about what we were talking about before, the fact that it is hard for a small country like Malta to figure out what its economic niche is in the neoliberal global era. I mean, and I don't pretend to have the answers. But what we all know is that successive governments in Malta have made a series of decisions to pretty much throw in with the shadow economy, right? To do various things, whether it's selling citizenship, whether it's that very, very low 5% corporate tax rate, to, or whether it's online gaming, to create opportunities for some pretty shady characters. And so what Daphne was doing with her journalism, what it was tapping into, regardless of what people's opinion is of her, right? That's really important, because if Malta's going to throw in on the shadow economy, sunlight is your best disinfectant. You need as many checks and balances as possible to prevent this from turning into a mafia state. And investigative journalists are a big part of that. So, this is not just about our profession. It's not just about the fact that we need journalists to be protected. We need governments not to make light of such a serious crime. It needs to be investigated. I personally strongly support the calls for an independent inquiry. And what chills me is the joking, I mean, just today, to hear that your justice minister is using Instagram to ask his followers if they like his beard better now, than him being clean shaven in the picture, which was, on the memorial wall. That communicates a message of a lack of seriousness about this crime. And when high-up officials act like that, it sends a message that journalists are fair game. That's what's happening with Trump, when every day he's out there going, fake news, you're the enemy of the people. I'm sorry, I link that with the Saudi Arabian government thinking that they could do to Jamal Khashoggi what they did to him, because they're hearing this from their most important ally. So we all, whatever our political differences are, have to understand how serious it is. This is no joking matter. It matters to writers. We're at, a fair celebrating writing. But it also matters to democracy. It really matters to democracy. So that's the end of my rant.
Thank you for
I'm going to butt out. But
and I think our audience does appreciate it, because it's also, I say it's a question of respect, but it's true, even in Malta. The way a politician speaks is very influential, and the way people get treated, I say treated, but the way journalists are spoken about by politicians obviously carries with the voters, and that relation with journalism, even investigative journalism, tends to be soured because of the way journalists get portrayed. So thank you for that. Thank you for mentioning that. We mentioned Trump, and also mentioned Corbyn and Sanders, and also the M25, Varoufakis' movement in Europe. There's something interesting about that, because in the response to austerity in Europe, because there's something very interesting in No Is Not Enough, where you talk about economic populism, and you say, yes, you say in No Is Not Enough, you say, learn to love economic populism. So it's very interesting, because it's something that sort of challenges that sort of neoliberal triumphalism, that consensus on the center. It tends to be a word that tends to be poisoned sometimes, because it's obviously associated with right wing. But what is economic populism, and why is it part of the response of a climate-based agenda for any political movement?
Right. So what Trump tapped into, and I think what Brexit tapped into as well, and what figures like Marine Le Pen in France are tapping into, is this feeling among a lot of people that there is this political class that some people call the Davos class, that are the people that have just rigged the whole system against them, and that it doesn't really matter which of the big establishment parties you vote for, you're going to end up getting variations on the same policies, which are about this revolving door of paybacks between politicians and large corporations, what Trump called the swamp, right? And that this this Davos world of big winners is completely uninterested in regular people. The fact that they're losing jobs, or if they have jobs, they're losing security, that they are living with extremes of economic precariousness, the social welfare net that used to be there that made it a little bit easier if you did lose your job has been so eroded. And so we are seeing this toxic mixture being used by the right of speaking to people who feel completely ignored by all the establishment parties, tapping into that anger, and rather than directing it at elites, or maybe they use the rhetoric, like Trump on the campaign trail talked about how he was going to drain the swamp, but the real target of the anger that is the most vulnerable, right? So for Trump, it's migrants coming from South America, also from majority Muslim countries. For Bolsonaro, it's people in the favelas, for Duterte in the Philippines, it's the drug dealers. I mean, there has to be a vulnerable population that you can direct the anger at. And so the mistake that these sort of establishment center-left or neoliberal politicians have made too often is to try to counter that with a sort of, well, as Hillary Clinton put it, love trumps hate, right? Or America is already great, right? That's what she said to Trump's Make America Great Again. America is already great. And that didn't work because people actually feel that their lives are not great, that people really are suffering. And so the argument I'm making when I say that we have to learn to love economic populism comes back to what I was saying before about the Sanders, green jobs, Green New Deal platform. I mean, Sanders went after the bankers, right? He went after the corporations that broke the global economy and passed the bill on to regular working people. He didn't do it in a way of like pitchforks, let's go storm the home of the CEO of Goldman Sachs. I think sometimes people think that that's what left-wing economic populism means. No, left-wing economic populism is about redistribution. It's about paying a fair tax rate. It's about cracking down on tax evasion and using that to tangibly improve people's lives, right? So the policies that are resonating most with people right now are raising the minimum wage to a living wage, universal public health care. You already have that, but in the US they don't have that. People will get excited about this, but they are not getting excited with just voting against the bad guy. That's why I called the book No Is Not Enough, because unfortunately, American liberals have been spending a lot of time just being anti-Trump, just trying to prove that the Russians bought the election, just trying to, show what a bad guy he is, and not proposing a coherent plan to address people's daily needs, not talking concretely about where the money is going to come from. So, you don't have to call it populism, but, populism is one of those words that has more cultural baggage in some places than in other places.
But it's at this intersection where we start seeing the sort of conglomeration of illiberal forces and hard right movements, which are basically capitalizing on forgotten pockets of people. I mean, we've seen it in Sweden with the New Democrats, and obviously it's happened in Italy, and it's happening in lots of places. In Germany, we're seeing the political landscape being totally altered, with traditional social democrat strongholds basically being wiped away, with the ascendancy also of the hard right. We'll be moving soon to a Q&A. I hope there are some questions from the audience. However, just one final question, because there's this really moving passage in This Changes Everything. And I think it does resonate. Well, I felt it resonates with my own personal experience, but I'm sure it also resonates with other people's feelings about the subject. it's basically about getting terms with a sort of with our ecological destiny, as it were. And in this passage, you're writing about becoming a mother, and I would like to read it. I wrote about how becoming a mother in an age of extinction brought the climate crisis into my heart in a new way. I had felt the crisis before, of course, as all of us do on some level, but for the most part, my climate fears expressed themselves as low-level melancholy, punctuated by moments of panic rather than full-blown grief. And this ecological despair was a big part of why I resisted having kids until my late 30s. And well, it's a longer piece, really. I would like to. I would have loved to read it all, but it really is a moving piece because I think it really resonates as well with the sort of feeling that I get as a father of two daughters, which is about the sort of resignation to this kind of ecological destiny, this kind of feeling of dread when we read some catastrophic piece of news dealing with climate change. And with also trying to imagine what the world will be like in 30, 40, 50 years. It's about the legacy we will be giving to our children. So what is the silver lining? Where is the silver lining for people, for people after taking in all the bad news?
I mean, the silver lining is that it's not too late. The latest IPCC report was very frightening, but they did say there is still a pathway for us to keep warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. We've warmed the planet by 1 degree Celsius. They were very clear that we can't warm the planet by 2 degrees, which is what our governments have been saying. The difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees is, you know, at least hundreds of thousands of lives. But we have the technologies to do it. And more than that, I would argue that in doing it, we have very little time. We need to, if we want to keep warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius, we need to lower our emissions, our fossil fuel emissions, by 45% in just 12 years. So that's an extraordinary project. That is a civilizational project, and the only kind of speed of transformation that would be analogous to that would be the way societies transform themselves to fight fascism during the Second World War, to retool their factories, to change the way they grew food. You know, in the United States, more than 40% of the produce that Americans ate during the Second World War came from gardens in people's backyards, so-called victory gardens. In Canada, during the Second World War, use of public transit went up by 90%. So there were these dramatic shifts. Leisure driving, just driving for leisure, was completely eliminated because people were conserving fuel. So facing this threat, an existential threat, people changed their lives, they came together, and we could do that. We could still do that. And I believe that in so doing, we would be creating better jobs that we could feel better about, feel prouder of, that would be a whole lot less ephemeral than the kind of jobs that are being created in the financial sector, the gaming sector. We would be building new energy systems, building new transportation systems, having an energy efficiency construction boom, and consuming less, consuming within our needs, consuming enough to live well, but consuming in a way that understood the concept of enough, which capitalism, trains us to never have enough, to think that any limit on consumption is sort of an assault to our liberty. So not only can we do it, but I believe that in doing it, we could solve many of our most pressing crises at the same time. And I think I think enormous effort is put into denying what we actually know. I believe we're all living with that dread. Even people who claim they never think about climate change, it's just in our peripheral vision all the time. Even this phrase that we hear all the time now, late capitalism. What does that even mean? Like, are we saying that there's a socialist revolution, or are we saying the world's about to end and we've all just accepted that, right? Like what? And so I think it's a crisis of imagination as well. You know, we're here at a book festival, and I always think about Ursula Le Guin before she died, the great science fiction writer. She talked about how important science fiction writers are because she said, we can imagine a world beyond capitalism. And I think part of the problem that we have is that we are locked within these apocalyptic narratives that take the end of the world or ecological collapse as a foregone conclusion. You know, it's the plot of basically every disaster movie you've ever seen set in the near future, right? And so we need writers, you know, and we need artists of all kinds who can stretch our imaginations to be able to believe that we might be worth saving, to help us imagine a future that isn't just slamming that foot on the accelerator and just becoming ourselves only worse, right? I mean, you think about what is happening now with migrants and refugees and the hardening of hearts that's happening in Europe, that's happening in the United States. I mean, the fact that Trump just ran an election treating thousands of extremely poor people, people who are so desperate, they are willing to walk through rivers with their small children, you know, many of them, you know, barefoot, just to get to a better life. And to say, that's an army, that's an invasion. I mean, the moral depravity that this moment is bringing to countries like this one and mine, you know, because of that fear, that on some level we know we are entering this era when there's going to be so many more people looking for safety. So that's the cost. Like, the cost is our own, we will become monsters in this world where we are creating. It isn't just about things getting hot. It's about things getting mean, and that meanness has started. So we can reject that, but it's going to require like a revolution of humanism and a moral imagination, the likes of which we seem to have forgotten.
Thank you very much, Naomi. Okay, so maybe we could take some questions. Shall we just take 3 at a go? And,
sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi. We mentioned the likes of Corbyn and Bernie Sanders, but in reality, they're not leading any country. Instead, we have the likes of Bolsonaro and Donald Trump across the pond. Next door, we have Matteo Salvini, there's Viktor Orban and Duterte. And the one thing, correct me if I'm wrong, but the one thing with all these countries is that the mainstream media almost unanimously took a stand against these people. And yet, they won the popular votes. Now, I come from the media background here myself, and I often ask myself this question: what are we doing wrong? Is it about our narrative? Are we talking down to the people? Because sometimes I get this kind of statement addressed to me, and it's a question we need to ask. You coming from this background, what is the reason why these environmental terrorists, dangerous people, sacrificing everything at the altar of money, why are they winning elections?
Mm-hmm. All right.
You just explained kind of the reality of the Trumpism in a way. But my question concerns also those kind of governments or politicians who look very much kind of some sort of mediator, some sort of a liberal kind of tradition. like Trudeau, or someone like Macron, or maybe even Merkel, kind of how would you situate these politicians in today's arena? Like, okay, they are not Trump, thank God, but on the other hand, are they contributing in a way to the Trumpism? Because while they are kind of taking us there, we are not there with them. No, like for example, you see it with Trudeau, like the First Nation situation in Canada. Like he is taking us towards it, but then at the end, nothing happens. And there is no emancipation happening. Mm-hmm. So these kind of, some sort of a third way or some sort of a, politicians who try to keep this kind of more balanced situation. Are they really balancing it out, or maybe they are even kind of pressing the speed towards an intense Trumpism? Mm-hmm. Are they really out of it, or they are leading us into it themselves? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And maybe because of this kind of lack of radicality that they are offering us. Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Maybe just another question.
Hi. My question regards the current consumer cornucopia in the Western nations, which is being embraced by emerging economies such as China and India, and arguably creating a sort of transnational consumer class. Since the universalization of Western consumerism is pretty much impossible environmentally, what would you suggest as a response to not only the West's generations of groomed consumers, but those in the burgeoning economies which feel like they deserve some of the luxuries of Western-style living? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Okay, those are all great questions. So, I mean, we live in an incredibly unequal world right now, and this is one of the big challenges of the climate crisis, which, as you say, this level of consumption is unsustainable, but a lot of people in the world want it. And so long as we have it, it's pretty hard to make an argument that, that they shouldn't have it. What we know for sure is that everybody in the world has the right to electricity, has the right to decent housing, has the right to food, has a right to those, having their basic needs met. And that's not happening, right? And that's not happening right now. So as we respond to climate change, not every country should do the same thing. And this has been the biggest conflict in international negotiations. It's why the US refused to join the Kyoto Protocol, because they said it was unfair because it demanded more emissions from wealthy countries like the US than it demanded of a country like India. Climate change requires a redistribution of wealth, right? So what we need to be doing, the wealthier countries have to subsidize poorer countries to be able to leapfrog over fossil fuels and go directly to renewables. And that is possible to do, but this has been the biggest stumbling block. And this is, I would argue, is one of the other examples of the historic bad timing that we're in. I mean, the whole idea of foreign aid and certainly the whole idea of redistribution has been under threat in this very period. So, I mean, that idea wouldn't have been such a challenging idea just 20 years ago, but now it is, or even less. Now the idea that there should be a transfer of wealth from north to south in order for all of us to be able to have a planet that we can live on, that is becoming seemingly less and less tenable. So this is why I say, we're not going to deal with any of this unless we have a revolution of values, unless we actually come to some basic understanding about the value of every single human being on the planet, that they have inherent value. If we don't agree on that, then we are going to rationalize allowing more and more people to drown, allowing more and more people to die on the land. I mean, this is where it's going. So, I mean, I would, from my research into climate change, it isn't so much about people demanding a lavish lifestyle. It's about people's right to electricity, right? And so I think that we can meet somewhere in the middle, and that's what we're going to have to do, as hard as that is to imagine. And if we say, oh, that's impossible, right? We just can't. Then we really have to follow that conclusion where it goes. Because if it is not possible, like I said, it isn't just about things getting hotter. It is about the fortressing and the hardening that we are seeing. That is really about the fact that we who have more are going to be unwilling to share that with the millions of people who are going to be forced to move. So the question about the first one, about the media and these figures, I mean, I think it's a little bit more complicated because you're certainly right that the U.S. media as a whole was against Trump. It is more complicated, though, because the U.S. media is so polarized, right? I mean, you have Fox News, which is where, and right-wing talk radio, and that's where a significant portion of, American voters, particularly politicized voters, right? Because you're talking about a country where a whole lot of people don't vote at all. So the people who are engaged in politics on the right are just dialed into Fox News, and they're getting, the Trump love-in all the time. But then the flip side of that was if you turned on CNN, turned on CNN during the election campaign, all you got was Trump too. I mean, Bernie barely got any coverage. It was very, very hard for him. And he was giving fiery speeches to stadiums filled with people. But I mean, what I would argue is happening in the U.S. is that every media outlet, but particularly cable news, but not just cable, everybody is experiencing ratings and clicks, the likes of which they've never seen. People are addicted to Trump and cannot stop giving him airtime because they're being rewarded through everybody's addiction to this reality show that is just so weirdly entertaining. And next to that reality show, everything, not just other politicians, but anything else in the world just can't get any coverage. I think that there are troubling questions about what is happening with media, but I would just say that I think that this is happening with these sort of really kind of entertaining strongmen characters that really know how to play the press, and I think we're going to see more of that, but also know how to get to their followers directly. And I think more and more we're going to see an end run around establishment media and directly to Facebook and other social media. I mean, we just experienced this in Canada where we've just elected a very right-wing government in Ontario, our most populous province. We elected the brother of the crack-smoking mayor. Do you remember Rob Ford? We just elected his charming brother, Doug. And he did this largely through Facebook. He started his own television station called Ford Nation. And he had his personal assistant interviewing him everywhere, and he didn't talk to journalists at all. So I don't know where that leaves us exactly. Now, the question about the Macrons and the Trudeaus, I mean, I would really agree that they are, not any kind of alternative bulwark to the Trumps. In a lot of, for Trudeau and Macron, I mean, they're great at communicating a progressiveness. Trudeau better than Macron. But, they're great at doing these sort of memes, like Macron did this, like, make the planet great again meme that was, like, retweeted 8 million, however many million times. Trudeau puts out this image of him, welcoming Syrian refugees at the airport. Meanwhile, they are sending people back to the United States as a so-called third country. So there's a huge gap between the marketing of progressiveness and what these governments are actually doing. I mean, on climate change, Trudeau positions himself as this big leader, and he's pushing expansion of the Alberta tar sands, which are one of the highest carbon fuels on the planet. And I think that this leads to what we were talking about before, which is it breeds this cynicism and it sets the table for the far right. Canada's not immune. We often are 8 years behind the United States, and same with France. So the fact that it hasn't happened yet does not mean it won't happen. And personally, I think Macron is playing with fire with his austerity policies. I'm terrified of what the Front National, how they will do in the next election after years of Macron's neoliberal austerity. And I'm very worried about my own country, about Canada in this context. We're not immune, even though our brand is so nice and friendly. We've got our own monsters in the closet.
Can we take this is a quick round of maybe 3 questions? There's someone over there, right over there. Okay.
Thank you. There's no question, I think, that capitalism is a forceful propeller of climate change. But I think that the problem is it won't change. We won't get out of the Anthropocene just through a revolution of ideas. I think the problem is so complexified at this point. Like, for example, we use cars. Our busy lifestyles require that we use cars. Cars, most of them need fossil fuels to work. Fossil fuels are transported through oil tankers, which might be susceptible to oil spills across the oceans. So I think the problem is so complexified and late that it's not enough to change. We might have to go back at some point. And not to mention the fact that one of the biggest problems of climate change is the sheer amount of resources that human beings use and the sheer amount of waste that we produce. So numbers, the huge amount of people in the world is in itself a cause of climate change. And how do we deal with that problem? Thank you.
Yes, and Simona, then there's a question from the lady over here. So I have 3 questions.
According to a United Nations report, a bigger polluter than transportation emissions is animal agriculture. Why is it that nobody ever mentions a bigger polluter than transportation?
Thank you. And over here, what's the question?
Hi. First of all, thank you for not tiptoeing around the political and governmental situation we have here. So my question is about the difference between top-down and bottom-up approaches. You've spoken a lot about policy and government and technology, and I think we see with the top-down approach, we see the problem of corruption and conflict of interest very often. So I guess what I'm asking is, do you have any advice on how we could maybe achieve more of a bottom-up approach, like a grassroots movement? Mm-hmm. I mean, in that case, then you have, again, like behavioral change mentioned as the main barrier, but yeah.
You have what? I missed that last part.
Behavioral change is mentioned as a really big barrier to bottom-up movements.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe your opinion on that, possibly also in the local Maltese context. Thanks.
Yeah. All right, so there's lots of great questions here. The latest IPCC report does talk about animal agriculture, and it's very clear that part, the days of just telling people to change your light bulbs and, making little changes that don't address these core lifestyle questions are over. So we are going to have to eat less meat. I think the question around why people focus on fossil fuels versus animal agriculture are complicated. I don't think there's a conspiracy theory about that. I think that it's just from a lobbying and sort of legislative point of view, it's a little bit easier to see what the policies are that would lead to a transition to low carbon transportation and energy than it is to think about how you legislate vegetarianism. And there was a question about population in there and just the general hopelessness. So, I mean, I hope I haven't come off as some sort of sunny optimist. You know, I really do think that the chances of us pulling this off are really slim, but the consequences of us failing to do so are so grave to our humanity, to any kind of safe future for kids who are alive today. We are not talking about future people. We are talking about people alive today. And what people are already experiencing. The stakes are so high that if there is absolutely any chance, if there is still a pathway, then the moral responsibility is to increase the chances. I don't believe that population is the major force here. The places where population is still growing significantly are the parts of the world where you have the lowest carbon footprint. High population growth is tightly tied to poverty and low carbon footprint. The problem is not poor people having babies. It is, as the young woman said earlier, it is the lifestyle of the wealthy. And we often change the subject from our lifestyle to the procreation habits of the poor, I think because it makes us feel better. So on the question of hope, and I think also on the question of, you know, top-down versus bottom-up, which is a really great question. I mean, I think there are models of some countries that have shown, you know, there is no country in the world that we can say, they've done it perfectly. But what we can do is we can point to a few examples of the kind of policies which, if we all did them, we'd be in a good place. Like, for instance, New Zealand, they have a progressive prime minister who has announced that there's not going to be any new fossil fuel extraction. And they've put and this has been a movement demand for a long time. Norway, you talked about cars. There is such a thing as electric cars, and Norway has committed that I think by 2030, all the new cars on the market are going to be electric. So there are countries that are doing it. There are policies that we can point to. I think Germany, energy transition, though far from perfect because they continue to dig up a whole lot of coal, but as they phased out nuclear and replaced with renewables, they adopted this model, which I would argue is the sort of is a bottom-up model, which based on energy democracy. So they introduced a feed-in tariff that encouraged community-controlled renewable energy, decentralized it by design, and you had that sort of rapid community buy-in. On the bottom-up versus top-down question, I mean, I've always been a bottom-up fan, and I've always supported social movements as opposed to the idea that it's just about getting the right person in office and then waiting. But what I think, one of the things that I think is really interesting about these political figures that we talked about, like Bernie Sanders or Jeremy Corbyn, is that they really do represent, and now there's a whole new generation of them, which we're seeing in the US, where it isn't an either-or. These are social movement candidates. They are being carried by social movement. I mean, Bernie's campaign was powered by Occupy Wall Street. It was people who were on the front lines of Occupy Wall Street and then went and, you know, did his big organizing. People like Becky Bond. I mean, I know many of those people because I met them at Occupy, and then they went and worked for Bernie. Momentum, and in the UK, and Jeremy Corbyn, you have this interesting, you know, inside-outside strategy within an establishment political party that has, you know, staged a revolution within the Labour Party in the UK. Some of the movement candidates in the U.S., like maybe you've heard about some of these people who are running, who have run and won as attorneys general with strong ties to the Black Lives Matter movement or the, you know, other criminal justice movements. What we're seeing are politicians that are being propelled by social movements and then being held accountable by social movements, right? So not just waiting and hoping that they keep their promises, but staying mobilized, staying in the streets, staying active, and also developing clear mechanisms to hold them to their promises. So, you know, I don't think we are in a moment where we can't afford to choose between the sort of small and local and grassroots versus political. I think there need to be political expressions of these movements, but we can't just think that getting somebody in office means that we don't need social movements. We sort of, it's a kind of a yes and all of the above, do it all hands on deck, yes.
Okay, I'm afraid we can't.
Yes.
I'm afraid we've run out of time. We cannot take any more questions. But Naomi, I would like to thank you so much. I would like to thank you for your work, for having spoken about journalism, for having spoken about Daphne Caruana Galizia. Thank you for your courage as well, and for your approach to how you produce your work, for your work over here, and for bringing to us the reality of climate change and its interconnectedness. Thank you for being in Malta.
Thank you, Matthew. It's my pleasure. Thank you so much.